We're turning our attention now to the impact of the Super League on women's football, and I'm delighted to welcome Suzy Wrack of The Guardian to the programme. Good morning to you, Suzy.
Good morning, how you doing?
Good, thanks. I was making the point earlier on that this might have been a bullet dodged by the women's game. Am I fair in saying that?
Oh, 100%. I mean, it's hard to know how serious they were about including the women's game in the proposals in the first place, in that obviously it was reduced to one sentence. Oh, after the men's is established, we will quickly set up a women's competition, I'm assuming in a similar format, but we weren't even told that. It's hard to know whether that was serious, but regardless of whether it was or not, it would have undoubtedly impacted clubs, even if there was no mention of women's football, because obviously all of these teams have women's teams. Chelsea are in the semi-finals of the Women's Champions League, playing on Sunday. City and Chelsea have got a big title decider tonight in the Women's Super League, and it would put incredible pressure on UEFA and the FA to make a decision about whether they should be allowed to compete in those tournaments. Because how could it possibly be conceivable that the animosity and the this political financial battle going on at the top of the men's game, how could that possibly not filter over into the women's game if you've got, say, City going up against Everton in the league? It's just not feasible. You can't have those clubs working in one corner of the game and not in another. There would be big repercussions across women's football as a result, because obviously you've got some of the biggest teams in England and in Europe involved, but then also you've got the exclusion of some of the biggest teams in Europe potentially if there was to be a women's format set up, with Lyon and Wolfsburg not involved on the men's side. They're the two most successful teams in Europe on the women's side, and you've potentially not got them involved in the competition. So there were so many different ramifications, and yet it was reduced to that one sentence in that initial launch, when like I say, regardless of whether they were included or not, they should have been a part of the conversation as to what would happen for governing bodies and UEFA generally with women's football as a result of the Super League on the men's side.
Yeah, they said as soon as practicable after the start of the men's competition, a corresponding women's league will also be launched, helping to advance and develop the women's game. This is right up there with the thought given to maybe the football pyramid and to helping those at grassroots level along over the next couple of years, because it didn't seem that there was any more detail to that, and you'd question whether the people who actually fronted this have had much of an influence in the growth of the women's game anyway over the past couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, the major players in the whole project of the European Super League, Real Madrid, Manchester United, Juventus, AC Milan, they've all had very, very fledgling women's teams. Man United's is 3 years old, Juventus's is 4 years old, that's the oldest. Real Madrid's is 1 season old. AC Milan have only just launched a team. They're all really new to the women's game. So, I mean, obviously you've got some of the more established teams in there, the Arsenals, Chelsea, Man City, Barcelona slightly longer than those four I mentioned at the start, but you've not got the key to European football. You've not got Lyon, you've not got Wolfsburg, 7-time winners Lyon of the Champions League, twice winners of the Champions League, Wolfsburg, and finalists last year as well, playing Lyon in the final. And so I mean it's inconceivable that these owners and executives of Manchester United, Real Madrid, and Juventus in particular, that only turn their attentions to women's football within the last 4 years at best, have the best interest of the women's game at heart. I mean, they were, in the case of Man United and Real Madrid in particular, pretty much dragged kicking and screaming into support for the women's game. There was real pressure on them, momentum from fans generally, but also, the pressure from the women's game generally in terms of coming from the FA itself, from FIFA, from UEFA, from the local confederations of some of the European teams, was really, really strong. You know, the FA were pushing very hard on Man United to get them to embrace the idea of a women's team, not just to get them to come on board, but to really embrace the concept of it and the potential for it. And they've come on board with what we know is their interest, with money in mind. You know, they've come on board because it's starting to show signs of profitability, not because they have any great love of the women's game, because they've shown that. So the idea that these should be in charge of the future, and that we should be grateful somehow for their inclusion of women's football in their proposals for this multi-billion pound European Super League project is crazy.
Suzy, I noticed you writing in recent days about, you know, women's football now should be about independence and sustainability from, you know, financial and governance point of views. So, you know, with women's teams in this European Super League being dragged along before the collapse, along with the men's teams, do you see a future where, in any way, maybe financially or otherwise, the women's teams almost split from the men's club or the parent club, so to speak, and forge their own path? Or how do you see that panning out in the coming years?
I don't think they'll split completely, in that I think that you'll still get these connections, these ties, the women's game, you know, Arsenal women feeding off the reputation of Arsenal more generally. And I think that's important. You know, there's a rich history there and a relationship between the club, between the two teams, and the club and the women's team. And, you know, I think there are benefits to having this kind of similar branding, for want of a better term, between the sides. But I think financial stability and independence will be important, that the women's football teams and clubs stand on their own 2 feet independently of the men's side. So, you know, they're not getting as big handouts from the men's clubs as a whole as they do now, that they're bringing in enough to warrant the investment that they're getting. And that is happening, you know, with the new broadcast rights deal, with the Barclays sponsorship of the Women's Super League, which expires at the end of next season and will need to be renewed, or there needs to be a new title sponsor. Assuming that deal is going to be a bigger one, as, you know, the previous one was the first. So money is starting to come into the game. So I think we'll see that more. But I think there's got to be a real look at how women's football is run, who's in charge of it, how clubs are run, and how women's football teams are, and that aspect of clubs is managed, because there's not any of the kind of checks or the supporters group. You know, there are supporters groups in women's football, but they're new. They're, you know, quite cheerleady at the moment, because they don't need to really do more. And I think we need to have a bit of a rethink about how much we trust the people involved in women's football, because obviously until very recently, anyone who was involved in women's football was involved in it because they believed in it. They had to be, otherwise you just wouldn't bother. It's not worth it. You know, you would lose money from any corner of the game, as a club, as a journalist, as whatever it may be, as a fan. You wouldn't make money from women's football. But now, with interest increasing and, you know, clubs sort of pressured into joining the party, whether they really, really believed in it or not, because the momentum was there and the money was starting to be visible, means that we sort of need to be a lot more careful with who we trust. You know, we got to think, you know, now we've got people involved in this sport with ulterior motives, with their own interests at heart, with the interests of their clubs more directly at heart, rather than just general growth and progress of the game. And I think we have to be very, very careful about who we trust with guardianship of women's teams and women's leagues. I also thought it was really interesting that, you know, the FA have done so much in the whole ESL debate, and really, like, put their cards on the table and said, you know, we're not standing for this, and we're going to stop player registrations from abroad and all that kind of stuff, and have really put a block on the any start-up for the ESL on the men's side. But yet the FA sort of has, you know, within however many years, has almost been very, very hesitant to challenge the Premier League or the big Premier League clubs in particular. You know, like there's almost be this fear of upsetting them, that we need them more than they need us, and we don't really actually have that much power over what they do, and we sort of have to ask for crumbs from the table. And we've seen that in women's football, in that, like, there's countries, leagues, women's leagues in the world where the men's the federations, I think, like in Latin America, Brazil possibly, where in order to get into the men's cup competition, the clubs have to have a women's team. That's, a requirement. So there's things that federations can do to push the women's game forward, but the FA has always stepped away from any kind of like hardline approach. It's always been we'll win them to it, we'll win them over, we'll win the support for this little initiative or that bit of money or whatever it may be. And I would like to see the FA generally, not just in women's football terms, like, in terms of, racism and all that kind of stuff too, where harder lines need to be taken, that they do that they wield this sort of this power a little bit more. They have been a part of preventing this from happening, and they are a not-for-profit organisation that is supposed to be there for the benefit of football. I would like to see them step in a little bit more on the women's side and the men's side, and hold the Premier League and Premier League clubs to account a little bit more, in the same way that obviously fans and stuff should too.
Like, I agree, and I'm totally fascinated to see how this whole European Super League nonsense is going to improve football in different ways. And like, I noticed in your article on Monday, you're even writing about how Liverpool improved their training ground and had even a beach volleyball court, but no room for the women's team involved. And the journalist Shireen Ahmed, I saw you were retweeting him last night. He was saying European men's football is falling apart like a terrible stadium that they make their women's teams practice and play in. Now, I know we've come along a little bit, and Manchester United's women's team played in Old Trafford, I think, recently for the first time. But we still have this sad and continuing reality in women's football that, in some sectors of women's football, that the women's teams just aren't treated at the same level as the men's. Is that one improvement, that even in something as basic as facilities, that maybe something positive can come from all of this?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot that can be taken from it, in that, there's huge money in football, as is evident by the greed of these richest clubs. They like, despite their pleas of poverty, they are not poor. They are still, whilst complaining about the pandemic and their losses on the one hand, in case of Real Madrid, eyeing up their next big Galacticos in the next sentence. It's the hypocrisy is revolting, and that needs to be exposed more, because obviously, as you say, there's huge hypocrisy on the women's side. Liverpool are the prime example. They had their women's player, the temporary manager of the women's team, buying bunk beds for their accommodation and things like that, because the club weren't supporting the housing issues that the team had a couple of years ago. And as a result, as of kind of mismanagement, lack of funding, lack of support, Liverpool were relegated last season. Have they bounced back this season? No, they haven't. You thought maybe it would be the kick up the butt they needed to suddenly start taking the team seriously, especially with the introduction of Manchester United onto the scene, and the sort of seriousness with which they are taking the women's team at the very, very bottom, at least. And also, the rise of Everton too. You thought maybe this might be a moment, this relegation might click something in the minds of the owners and the leadership structures of Liverpool that says, hang on, we've got to take this seriously. But then next minute, you've got the nice shiny training ground launched, and no space for the women's team, no mention of the women's team, who still play at Tranmere, who have had games cancelled because their pitches have been waterlogged and frozen and just basically muddy bogs. Tranmere's been really, really torn up over Christmas. And then you've got, Arsenal manager Joe Montemurro has said he's leaving at the end of the season, and whilst he's very, very adamant that it's unrelated, there is a lot of talk that there are much deeper troubles at Arsenal, that the investment and the support for the team isn't as strong as it could be, that as a result of the pandemic, the women's team are training at the Hale End Academy site instead of at London Colney, and there's frustrations about that as well. These aren't I suppose the treatment of their women's teams is an indication of just how serious they are about football for fans in a way, because if they cared about football playing a broader role in society and communities, and kind of being representative and born from the communities and workplaces that they were born from, then they would care about the women's side and they would look after it. It's women are 50% of the world's population. They're an important part of communities. They would have a more maternalistic approach to those teams, but they don't. And that shows that reflects the real ambitions of these clubs, which is profit, money, and whatever's going to get us there, we'll support. And that's what's starting to change. They're starting to see, wait a minute, there's money to be made in this game. The big sponsors are starting to come in. The broadcasters are starting to come in. So maybe we'll suddenly start upping our investment. And at the moment, it's very cheap to do very, very well in women's football very, very quickly, as Man United have shown. They've only been in 3 years. They've gone from the Championship, won it in the first season in the WSL, they finish fourth, I think. And now they've, this season, really kind of fought at the top end of the table, and probably will miss out on Champions League football, but become very, very close to getting it within 3 years. So it doesn't take a lot of money to be successful. That will change, but at the moment they're starting to see, oh wait a minute, there's something to be made here. We can make some money here, and that's why we're getting interested. It's not care for the game, it's not love for the game. And I think that reflects their ambitions more broadly. Yeah,
and if you're looking at it in a cynical way, you'd like to think now that those clubs that were involved in the breakaway league will have to try and wrestle back some sort of respect with the local communities, and maybe a bit of added investment in the women's game wouldn't do them any harm on that front, but I guess the WSL might actually benefit from that, so nobody will be complaining. So it's going to be a very interesting few months. Suzy, thanks very much for taking the call this morning. Really appreciate your time.
No problem. Thanks for having me. It's nice to chat about it.
Cheers. That's Suzy Wrack there of The Guardian, and you can check out her work on The Guardian.